All right, so you're ready to take a deep dive into pre-World War II Germany.
We're talking about the lead up to the rise of National Socialism, right?
Exactly. And we're using Mein Kampf
Mm.
to help us understand this period. Now, it goes without saying, this is a complex and, well, sensitive text,
Extremely.
but we're approaching it carefully.
Of course, we're not here to condone or endorse any of it.
Not at all. We're here to analyze Mein Kampf as a historical document.
To try and understand its context, really get inside Hitler's head.
Yeah, unpack the twisted logic that ultimately captivated a nation. Basically, we're going to be your guides as we explore.
As we explore his worldview and the world he lived in.
Right, however distorted that view might be. So the book kicks off with Hitler's early life, and right away,
You start to see.
yeah, those early seeds of his later beliefs, like, for instance, his relationship with his father.
A very strained relationship.
Really strained. He desperately wanted to be an artist.
An architect, specifically.
Right, an architect, but his father pushed him toward
a civil service career, something much more practical.
And it's not just the push towards a different career path.
It's how Hitler frames this conflict that's so revealing.
You really see the resentment there.
He describes his father's reaction to his artistic ambition
As almost like disgust.
disbelief, disgust, even wondered if his son was in his right mind.
Wow.
His father literally exclaimed, "A painter, an artist."
He even quotes his father saying that.
Word for word.
That's intense.
You can feel the tension in that memory.
Definitely. And then there's his move to Vienna
Where he really struggled.
to find work.
Unskilled laborer, tough times.
Yeah, lots of economic insecurity. And it seems like this period really had a big impact on him.
On shaping his worldview, for sure.
You know, we've talked about his interest in propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
And it almost feels like these experiences fueled this need
This need to find a scapegoat.
to blame someone for his struggles.
It's a common human reaction, unfortunately.
And Vienna at that time, what was it like?
A melting pot
Of what?
of social and political tensions, and Hitler was right in the thick of it.
So he talks about Vienna in the book.
Oh, yeah. He describes witnessing poverty, social ills,
Like what kinds of social ills?
widespread unemployment, crime, homelessness, and...
And what he saw as the failures of the Austrian government.
Absolutely, he was very critical of the government.
Did he have any specific experiences that stood out?
Any experiences that really shaped his later anti-Semitism?
Yeah.
There's this passage where he describes encountering a figure.
Someone specific?
He describes him as an Eastern Jew for the first time.
And what was his reaction?
He fixates on the man's appearance.
His clothes, his mannerisms.
Right, paints this picture of someone fundamentally different.
Alien. Even
Yeah, almost otherworldly, and it's in this encounter
that he claims to have realized something,
that the Jewish population wasn't simply a religious group.
but a distinct race.
Exactly, separate from the German people.
But historians point out that Vienna at that time,
Had a substantial Jewish population, and they were largely assimilated.
so what does that tell us?
It suggests that Hitler's framing of this encounter,
His perception of Jews as other,
it was very much a deliberate choice.
a choice shaped by the prevailing anti-Semitism of the time.
Exactly. He wasn't forming his views in a vacuum.
So it's not just about seeing poverty or social ills
It's about attributing those problems
to a specific group.
to create an us versus them dynamic.
A very dangerous dynamic.
Yeah.
And all this is happening while he's becoming more interested
In architecture, remember, he wanted to be an architect.
Oh, right.
And that led him to spend a lot of time self-educating,
on social issues.
reading books, immersing himself in these topics.
So that's when he really starts to dig into the existing anti-Semitism.
This is where it takes hold.
So it's important to note.
He initially describes himself as skeptical of anti-Semitic claims.
So initially she didn't believe it,
That's what he says.
but then he changes his mind,
He does, gradually shifts towards those beliefs.
using his experiences as justification.
Or at least his interpretation of them.
A classic example of how pre-existing prejudice can be reinforced.
By personal circumstances, absolutely.
And he even goes so far as to say that to understand social democracy,
You must understand the language of the Jew.
he really believed that.
He did, and it all intertwines with his exploration of Marxist theory.
Which he also interprets through an anti-Semitic lens.
Exactly. He starts to see a Jewish conspiracy everywhere, behind social ills, intellectual movements, political movements,
A classic example of scapegoating.
where complex problems are oversimplified and blamed on a single group.
Exactly. A very dangerous oversimplification.
And this all seems to tie in with his growing disillusionment.
with parliamentary democracy,
Because Vienna at the time was, like you said.
a melting pot of political tensions.
So how did that climate specifically impact his views?
Well, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, of which Vienna was the capital,
Okay.
it was a multi-ethnic, multilingual state
Very diverse.
with a complex political system, and it was struggling.
Struggling economically. Economically and facing lots of social unrest.
So Hitler saw this as proof,
As proof that democracy was inherently weak.
especially in a multi-ethnic state.
Yeah. He thought it was just too prone to instability.
And he really goes after the Austrian parliament in the book.
He saw it as a chaotic mess of squabbling factions.
Unable to act decisively.
He longed for a strong, centralized leadership.
A single leader who could unite everyone.
Under a single vision, that's what he wanted.
So he basically rejects the very idea of compromise and collaboration.
The cornerstones of democracy.
And he saw them as weaknesses.
Not strengths, he wanted a strong man.
A dictator.
Essentially, yes.
So we're seeing this dangerous cocktail brewing in his mind.
Resentment, prejudice, authoritarianism
And it's at this point that the concept of Volkisch ideology.
becomes really important to understanding his worldview.
Can you explain that a bit? What is Volkisch ideology?
So imagine a tree with its roots representing the pure German folk.
Okay, I'm imagining it.
Volkisch ideology basically says that the German people
The Volk,
are a racially pure and united entity.
bound by blood and soil.
Exactly.
And Hitler really latched onto this
He
idea,
did, with fervor.
believing that any foreign element
Like a parasite.
would weaken this tree.
Corrupt it, destroy it even.
And he believed in the superiority
Of the so-called Aryan race.
a fictional construct, of course.
With no scientific basis whatsoever.
But he saw the need to preserve racial purity as paramount.
Absolutely central to his worldview.
He even connected racial purity to German art and architecture.
Bringing it back to his artistic aspirations.
Interesting. So he's not just talking about national pride here.
He's talking about racial purity and superiority.
A very dangerous and disturbing vision.
One rooted in pseudoscience and prejudice.
And he connects this directly to his views on nationalism.
To his vision of a strong and racially homogeneous German state.
And it's a vision that starts to take on a more concrete form.
As he enters the next stage of his life.
World War I.
A pivotal moment for sure.
A moment that would solidify his beliefs and set him on a dark path.
Towards his ultimate ambition.
Let's dive into that in part 2 of our deep dives.
We left off with Hitler entering World War I.
The pivotal moment for him.
Yeah, and Mein Kampf really digs into his experiences during the war.
And how they shaped his worldview.
He starts by describing his initial enthusiasm.
For the war.
Seeing it as a chance for national unity.
And a test of German strength.
Exactly, but as the war dragged on.
And Germany faced mounting losses.
His enthusiasm soured.
Into disillusionment.
And a sense of betrayal.
Betrayal by whom?
The German government, for one.
He felt they mishandled the war.
Yeah, and even within German society itself.
Where he saw growing pacifist sentiment as weakness.
A stab in the back, he called it.
And this idea of betrayal.
It became a cornerstone of his later political rhetoric.
Interesting. There's also that anecdote about his reaction to Germany's defeat.
Oh yeah, the one where he is hospitalized.
For temporary blindness.
Likely caused by a mustard gas attack.
And that's when he receives news of the armistice.
A crushing blow, he writes, of feeling despair and rage.
Viewing the armistice as a surrender.
Not a necessary end to a devastating war.
So that bitterness over the loss and the Treaty of Versailles,
which he saw as unjustly punishing Germany.
This fueled his post-war political awakening.
Absolutely.
And he returns to Munich.
And dives headfirst into this turbulent world of post-war German politics.
What was the political climate like in Germany at the time?
Chaotic, lots of unrest, widespread discontent.
People were struggling.
Economically and feeling deeply humiliated.
By the terms of the Treaty of Versailles.
And Hitler was able to tap into that resentment.
To channel it towards his own political goals.
Very effectively, he was a master manipulator.
So he joins the German Workers' Party.
A small fringe group at the time.
And quickly rises through the ranks.
Transforms it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party.
The Nazi Party.
Exactly.
And what's striking is how quickly he understood the power of propaganda.
And the importance of public speaking.
He really had a knack for it.
He understood how to simplify complex ideas.
To appeal to people's emotions.
Rather than their intellect.
And then repeat those messages relentlessly.
Over and over again.
You mentioned that he often spoke at beer halls and rallies,
Those were his favorite venues.
tailoring his message to his audience
Using fiery rhetoric and dramatic gestures.
to get the crowd riled up.
He knew how to work a crowd, that's for sure.
So he really tailored his message to different groups.
Absolutely, when addressing veterans.
He'd emphasize betrayal and national rejuvenation,
And when speaking to the working class.
economic anxieties and the threat of communism,
Playing on their fears.
almost like he was building a cult of personality.
With himself at the
A
center.
very astute observation.
He cultivated this image of the strong, decisive leader.
The only one who could save Germany.
From its enemies, both internal and external.
And this ties back to his rejection of parliamentary democracy.
He had no faith in democracy.
So how did this play into his vision for the Nazi Party?
Well, he outlines his principles for the party.
In Mein Kampf.
Yeah, and he emphasizes the rejection of democratic principles.
In favor of
Strong, centralized leadership.
a top-down structure.
With himself at the apex.
Of course. So the way the Nazi Party functioned was a model for how he wanted to run Germany.
Exactly. Control, obedience, and the absolute authority of the leader.
And this brings us to his foreign policy goals.
Which he lays out quite clearly in Mein Kampf.
He rejects any notion of compromise or diplomacy,
Instead, he argues for aggressive expansionism,
specifically what he calls an Eastern policy.
aimed at territorial expansion into Eastern Europe.
Lebensraum, he called it, living space for the German people.
And he sees Russia as weak and ripe for exploitation.
This idea of Lebensraum wasn't new, though, was it?
No, it had been circulating in German nationalist circles for some time.
But Hitler really embraced it,
With a singular fervor, using it to justify his vision of a German empire.
stretching across Eastern Europe.
A terrifying vision.
He also outlines his views on the role of the state.
A vision rooted in racial purity and authoritarianism.
The state should serve the people.
And the people should be racially pure.
And he sees the state as a tool to achieve this racial purity.
Advocating for policies that would prevent those he deemed unfit.
From having children.
This is essentially eugenics.
A pseudoscientific ideology based on selective breeding.
That had gained some traction in the early 20th century.
But Hitler took it to a horrific extreme. His views on the Jewish population are particularly chilling.
He doesn't just see them as different.
He portrays them as a threat,
A parasitic force undermining German society.
and he calls for their removal.
Framing them as an obstacle to his vision of a racially pure German state. It's one of the most disturbing aspects of the book.
This demonization of the Jewish population.
Foreshadowing the horrors of the Holocaust.
His writing is laced with such hatred
A hatred that would have devastating consequences.
for millions of people
And it's important to remember,
that while Hitler was the architect of the Holocaust,
he didn't operate in a vacuum.
his ideas resonated with a segment of the German population.
Those who felt disenfranchised and disillusioned after World War I,
So while Mein Kampf gives us this disturbing glimpse into Hitler's mind
it also serves as a cautionary tale.
about the dangers of unchecked hatred,
And the importance of understanding the historical context.
in which such ideologies can take root. It's like Mein Kampf is this blueprint for his political ambitions.
Yeah, he's not just reflecting, he's strategizing.
It's both fascinating and terrifying to see how methodically he lays it all out.
Like he knows achieving power won't happen overnight.
Right.
He needs to create a movement, a force, to challenge the existing order.
And that's where the Nazi Party comes in.
Exactly.
And he really stresses the need for a dedicated paramilitary force.
The SA, the storm detachment.
It's not enough to spread ideas. He needs the muscle to enforce them.
To disrupt political meetings, intimidate opponents, create fear.
A calculated strategy of intimidation and violence.
Designed to silence any dissent and project an image of strength.
He understood that power often comes from force.
And he wasn't afraid to use it.
He also spends a lot of time attacking his political opponents,
And it's not just disagreement, it's pure hatred.
mostly directed at Marxists and Jews.
He uses such inflammatory language, accusing Jews of being parasites,
Destroyers of culture,
calling for their removal from German society.
framing them as a threat to the German people.
It's truly horrifying to read those passages.
Knowing what would happen during the Holocaust.
Chilling, to say the least.
And he also understood the power of symbols and imagery,
Oh, absolutely.
like the swastika as the emblem of the Nazi movement.
And the red, white, and black color scheme for their flag.
Those weren't random choices.
No, they were carefully chosen to evoke specific emotions.
To create a sense of identity, a sense of belonging.
He knew how to tap into those primal instincts.
So he's building a movement,
Yeah.
but also creating a cult.
With himself as the central figure, the object of worship.
And that cult of personality would prove to be incredibly effective.
In captivating a segment of the German people and paving the way for his rise.
His rise to absolute power, yeah.
So Mein Kampf is a chilling reminder of how dangerous charismatic leadership can be.
Especially when combined with a hateful ideology.
And a ruthless disregard for human life.
So what can we take away from all of this? From this deep dive into Mein Kampf?
Well, I think we've seen how Hitler's personal experiences
His twisted ideology.
and his masterful understanding of propaganda.
All these things combine to create the conditions for the rise of National Socialism.
And it's a stark warning about the dangers of extremism.
The seductive power of scapegoating.
And the fragility of democracy.
Especially in the face of authoritarianism. This has been a sobering experience,
To say the least.
but also incredibly valuable.
In helping us understand this crucial period in history.
We've explored the dark corners of Hitler's mind.
Dissected his twisted logic.
And traced the roots of his hateful ideology. But Mein Kampf is just one piece of the puzzle.
There's so much more to explore and understand.
We got inside Hitler's head, saw how he saw the world.
Now it's your turn to expand the exploration.
Consider the broader historical context.
The social, economic, and political conditions in Germany.
What allowed Hitler's ideas to take root?
What role did other individuals and institutions play?
These are complex questions, but essential to grapple with.
If we truly want to understand this dark chapter of history,
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
keep exploring, keep learning.